The thunderous crack of lightning illuminated Abigail Monroe's terrified face as she pounded her fists against the locked door of her own home. Rain cascaded down her trembling body, soaking through her cotton dress until it clung to her skin like a second layer. Her husband's cruel laughter echoed from inside their small farmhouse on the outskirts of Whispering Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878. "Edward, please," she cried, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You cannot leave me out here all night." "You'll stay out there until you learn your lesson, woman," Edward Monroe shouted through the door. "Maybe the rain will wash away that defiant spirit of yours." Abigail sank to her knees on the muddy porch, her shoulders shaking with sobs. 3 years of marriage to Edward had taught her that his rage could outlast any storm. What had begun as a promising union had deteriorated into a prison of fear and pain. Tonight's transgression. She had spoken to Mr. Jenkins at the general store for too long while purchasing supplies. Edward's jealousy knew no bounds. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Abigail spotted a figure on horseback approaching their isolated property. Fear clutched at her heart. Strangers rarely brought good news, especially during a storm of this magnitude. The rider drew closer, and Abigail could make out the silhouette of a tall man atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the downpour, a long duster coat, and beneath it, she glimpsed the glint of a star-shaped badge. "Hello there." The stranger called out, his deep voice carrying over the storm's fury. "Is everything all right, madam?" Abigail hastily wiped her tears, though the rain made the gesture futile. "I'm fine, sir," she replied automatically, years of hiding her troubles making the lie come easily. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to the post before approaching. As he stepped onto the porch, Abigail could see his features more clearly, a strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble, piercing blue eyes that reflected concern, and a weathered face that had seen its share of hardship. "Deputy Elijah Blackwood, madam," he introduced himself, removing his hat in a gesture of respect despite the rain. Water dripped from his dark hair as he studied her with obvious concern. "You don't look fine to my eyes. Why are you outside in this weather?" Before Abigail could formulate another lie, Edward's voice boomed from inside. "Who's out there?" "Abigail, who are you talking to?" The door flew open, revealing Edward Monroe's imposing figure. At 35, he stood a head taller than Abigail, with broad shoulders and fists that had left their mark on her more times than she cared to remember. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the deputy. "What business do you have on my property?" Edward demanded, deliberately ignoring his drenched wife. Deputy Blackwood's expression hardened as he took in the situation. "I was passing by and noticed the lady outside during this storm. Thought I'd check if assistance was needed. My wife and I had a disagreement," Edward stated flatly. "Nothing that concerns the law." Elijah's gaze shifted between Edward's rigid stance and Abigail's trembling form. His jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Perhaps the lady would like to come inside now. This rain's getting worse." "She'll come in when I say she comes in," Edward retorted, stepping forward menacingly. Elijah's hand moved subtly toward his holster. "Sir, I cannot in good conscience leave a woman outside in these conditions. Either she comes in, or I'll have to insist she accompanies me to town for her safety." The tension stretched between the two men like a bowstring pulled taut. Abigail held her breath, knowing Edward's pride would never allow him to back down without consequences later. After a tense moment, Edward's face twisted into a forced smile. "Of course, Deputy. I was just about to let her in myself. A silly argument, nothing more." He stepped aside, gesturing for Abigail to enter. Abigail hesitated, her eyes meeting Elijah's. In that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of a shared understanding. "Thank you for your concern, Deputy," she said softly, moving past Edward into the house. Elijah nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll be passing this way again tomorrow, checking on folks after the storm," he said pointedly, his eyes locked on Edward. The message was clear, he would be watching. As the deputy mounted his horse and disappeared into the stormy night, Abigail felt a curious mixture of dread and hope. Edward's thunderous expression promised retribution, but the memory of those kind blue eyes gave her something she hadn't felt in years, the possibility of escape. The moment the door closed behind her, Edward's facade of civility vanished. He grabbed Abigail's arm with bruising force, pulling her close until his face was inches from hers. The smell of whiskey on his breath made her stomach turn. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed. "Getting the law involved in our private affairs." "I didn't call him Edward," Abigail protested, wincing at his grip. "He was just passing by." Silence. Edward shoved her away, causing her to stumble against the wooden table. "Go change out of those wet clothes before you drip all over my floor. And don't think this is over. That deputy won't always be around to play your knight in shining armor." Abigail retreated to their bedroom, peeling off her sodden dress with trembling fingers. As she dried herself and changed into a nightgown, her mind raced with possibilities. The deputy had said he would return tomorrow. Perhaps. But no, what could she possibly do? Edward would never let her leave, and she had nowhere to go even if she could. She had married Edward Monroe at 18, desperate to escape her father's strict household after her mother's death. Edward had seemed like salvation, then handsome, established with his own land and promising a life of security. The first year had been tolerable, even pleasant at times. But after his crops failed and debts mounted, Edward had turned to the bottle for comfort and to Abigail for blame. Now, at 21, she felt decades older, trapped in a life that offered no escape. Sleep evaded Abigail that night as she lay beside Edward's snoring form, careful not to disturb him. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, giving way to the gentle patter of a light rain by dawn. When morning came, Edward was unusually subdued. He ate the breakfast Abigail prepared in silence, then announced he was heading to town for supplies. "I expect this place to be spotless when I return," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "And Abigail, it would be best if you weren't here when that deputy comes sniffing around again." Abigail's heart sank. "Where should I go?" "Visit Martha Wilkins. Her husband says she's been asking after you." Edward grabbed his hat. "Stay there until sundown. I'll deal with our nosy lawman." After Edward departed, Abigail moved through her chores mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Martha Wilkins was kind enough, but her husband Thomas was Edward's drinking companion. Going there would only ensure that Edward would know her exact whereabouts all day. As she hung laundry on the line under the clearing sky, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart race. Turning, she saw Deputy Blackwood riding toward the house, just as he had promised. Without Edward present, panic and relief warred within her. Elijah dismounted, securing his horse before approaching. In the daylight, Abigail could see him more clearly, tall and lean, with a purposeful stride that spoke of confidence without arrogance. His badge glinted in the morning sun, but it was the gentleness in his eyes that struck her most. "Good morning, Mrs. Monroe," he said, removing his hat. "I trust you're feeling better today." Abigail glanced nervously down the road, half expecting to see Edward returning. "My husband isn't here, Deputy. He's gone to town." "I came to check on you, madam, not him." Elijah's directness was startling. "May I speak plainly?" At her hesitant nod, he continued, "This wasn't the first time he's locked you out, was it?" Abigail's hands twisted in her apron. Denial rose to her lips out of habit, but something in Elijah's steady gaze made the words die unspoken. "No," she admitted softly. "It wasn't." "Does he hurt you in other ways?" The question hung between them like a physical thing. Abigail felt tears sting her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. "Deputy Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but this is my marriage, my burden to bear. It doesn't have to be." Elijah stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that he didn't have to raise his voice. "I've seen this before, Mrs. Monroe. It doesn't get better, it gets worse." What would you have me do? Abigail's voice cracked with desperation. I have no family, no money of my own. Where would I go? There are options, Elijah said firmly. The church in town takes in women in difficult situations, or there's Mrs. Haverston's boarding house, she's helped others before. Abigail shook her head. Edward would find me, this is a small town. Then perhaps it's time to consider a new town. Elijah's gaze was unwavering. The stage to Cheyenne leaves every Tuesday. From there, you could go anywhere. The possibility was so tantalizing that Abigail almost couldn't bear it. Freedom. A new beginning, but reality crashed back quickly. With what money, Deputy? On what skills could I support myself? You're intelligent, articulate. I'm certain you could find work as a teacher's assistant or in a shop. He paused, then added more softly, and I would help you. Abigail stared at him, stunned by the offer. Why? You don't even know me. I know enough, he replied simply. I know that no one deserves to live in fear in their own home. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of a wagon. Panic flashed across Abigail's face. You should go. If Edward sees you here, I'm not afraid of your husband, Mrs. Monroe. Well, I am, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, for both our sakes. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. I'll go, but remember what I said. Tuesday's stage. If you decide to be on it, I'll make sure you get away safely. He replaced his hat and turned toward his horse, then paused. One more thing, Mrs. Monroe. Yes, my mother's name was Abigail too. She endured 15 years with my father before she found the courage to leave. Her only regret was not doing it sooner. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Abigail standing by her laundry line, her mind reeling with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks performed by muscle memory while Abigail's thoughts raced. Tuesday was just 2 days away. Could she truly gather the courage to leave everything behind? Where would she go? How would she survive? By the time Edward returned that evening, she had composed herself enough to present a facade of normalcy. He seemed satisfied with her story of spending the day with Martha Wilkins, even though she had never left the property. Did that deputy come back? Edward asked casually over dinner, though Abigail could sense the underlying tension in his question. No, she lied, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. I haven't seen anyone all day. Edward nodded, seemingly appeased. Good, I spoke with Sheriff Taylor in town. Apparently, Blackwood is new to the territory, transferred from somewhere back east. Too soft for frontier justice, if you ask me. Abigail kept her eyes on her plate, afraid her expression might betray her. I'm sure the sheriff knows what he's doing, hiring him. Taylor didn't have much choice. They're short-handed since Deputy Collins was killed in that bank robbery. Edward took a long drink of whiskey. Still, a man should keep his nose out of another man's business, badge or no badge. That night, as Edward slept beside her, Abigail stared at the ceiling, making mental calculations. She had a small amount of money hidden away, coins saved from household expenses over the years, tucked into a hollow book on the shelf. Not much, but perhaps enough for a stage ticket and a few days' lodging. But what then? Elijah's confidence in her abilities was flattering but misplaced. What did he see in her that she couldn't see in herself? Monday dawned bright and clear, as if the recent storm had never happened. Edward announced he would be spending the day repairing the fence in the north pasture, giving Abigail unexpected freedom to move about without his watchful eye. She used the opportunity to take inventory of her few possessions, mentally selecting what she could feasibly take if she decided to leave. Her mother's locket, a small daguerreotype of her parents, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, practical items that could fit in a single bag. The very act of planning felt like rebellion, sending both thrills and tremors of fear through her. By midday, she had secreted her small cache of coins into a handkerchief and tucked it into her pocket, just to feel its weight, the weight of possibility. As she hung the last of the washing on the line, the sound of an approaching rider sent her heart into her throat. Not Edward, he would have come from the north field. This rider approached from the direction of town. Relief and anxiety mingled when she recognized Deputy Blackwood. He dismounted at a respectful distance, approaching on foot with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Monroe," he greeted her. "I hope I'm not intruding." "My husband is in the fields," Abigail said, glancing nervously in that direction. "He could return at any moment." Elijah nodded in understanding. "I'll be brief. Have you given any thought to what we discussed?" Abigail's hands twisted in her apron. "I've thought of little else, Deputy. And, I'm afraid," she admitted, the words catching in her throat, "not just of Edward, but of the unknown. Who would I be without this place, this life? As terrible as it sometimes is, it's all I know." Elijah's expression softened. "Sometimes the unknown is frightening precisely because it holds so much possibility. You could be anyone you choose to be, Mrs. Monroe." A wistful smile touched Abigail's lips. "I always wanted to be a teacher before I married. I love books, learning." "Then perhaps that's who you should become," Elijah suggested. "Cheyenne has a growing school system. They're always in need of educated women." "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple," he corrected. "Difficult, frightening, but possible. Worth fighting for." Their conversation was cut short by the distant figure of Edward, returning from the fields earlier than expected. Abigail's face drained of color. "You must go," she urged, panic rising in her voice. Elijah stood his ground. "I'm not leaving you to face his anger alone. Please," Abigail pleaded. "It will be worse if he sees us together. I need time to think, to decide. Tomorrow the stage, I'll make my decision by then." Reluctantly, Elijah nodded. "Tomorrow, then. The stage departs at noon. If you choose to be on it, I'll be there." He hesitated, then added, "If you choose to stay, I'll respect your decision, but I hope you won't." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing down the road just as Edward came within earshot of the house. Edward's suspicion was palpable as he questioned why she was standing idle, watching the road. Abigail fabricated a story about hearing a rider pass by and wondering if it might be the doctor for old Mrs. Jenkins down the way. That evening, tension hung over the dinner table like a storm cloud. Edward drank more heavily than usual, his mood darkening with each glass of whiskey. Abigail treaded carefully, keeping conversation minimal and focusing on serving the meal without drawing his ire. "I saw tracks near the house today," Edward said suddenly, his words slightly slurred. "Horse tracks that weren't mine," Abigail's heart hammered in her chest. "Perhaps it was someone passing through," she suggested, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Passing through our private road, not likely?" Edward's eyes narrowed. "That deputy been sniffing around again?" "I haven't seen Deputy Blackwood since the night of the storm," Abigail lied, hating herself for the deception but knowing the truth would be dangerous. Edward studied her face for a long moment, then seemed to accept her answer. "Good. Man needs to learn his place." As the evening progressed, Edward's drinking continued. By the time they retired to bed, he was in a state Abigail recognized all too well, the calm before the storm of his temper. She lay beside him, rigid with tension, listening to his breathing grow deeper as sleep claimed him. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she would have to decide, stay and endure this life until it broke her completely, or risk everything for a chance at something better. The weight of the decision kept her awake long into the night. When morning came, Abigail rose early, moving quietly to avoid waking Edward. She prepared breakfast mechanically, her mind elsewhere, rehearsing what she would say if she chose to leave, imagining Edward's reaction, the possible consequences. "You're quiet this morning," Edward observed as he ate, his tone suspiciously pleasant after last night's drinking. "Just tired," Abigail replied. "I didn't sleep well." Edward nodded, seeming distracted himself. "I'm heading to the Wilkins place after breakfast. Thomas and I need to discuss the cattle drive next month." Relief washed over Abigail. If Edward would be gone most of the day, she could prepare without his watchful eye. "Will you be home for dinner?" "Likely not until evening," Edward confirmed, rising from the table. "Keep yourself occupied with your chores, no visitors." The pointed look he gave her made it clear that the warning was specifically about Deputy Blackwood. Abigail nodded obediently, avoiding his gaze. After Edward departed, Abigail stood in the center of the kitchen, paralyzed by indecision. The stage would leave at noon. If she was going to act, she needed to do so now. With trembling hands, she retrieved her hidden coins and the small bundle of possessions she had prepared the day before. The locket from her mother felt heavy around her neck, a reminder of the woman who had endured her own difficult marriage until death had claimed her. Would she want this fate for her daughter? The answer came with surprising clarity. No, her mother would want more for her. She would want Abigail to live, not merely survive. Decision made, Abigail changed into her best dress, a modest blue cotton garment that had been a wedding gift from Mrs. Jenkins. She packed her remaining clothes and personal items into a small carpet bag, then penned a brief note to Edward, explaining that she could no longer live in fear and asking him not to search for her. The note felt both inadequate and excessive. What could words on paper convey about years of suffering? What explanation did she owe a man who had locked her out in a thunderstorm? Nonetheless, she left it on the kitchen table, a final act of courtesy that he had never shown her. With one last look at the house that had been both home and prison, Abigail stepped outside and began the long walk toward town. The 2-mile journey would take nearly an hour on foot, but she had allowed herself plenty of time to reach the stage before noon. The morning was pleasantly warm, the aftermath of the storm leaving the air clean and the countryside vibrant with renewed life. Birds sang in the trees alongside the road, and wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. For the first time in years, Abigail felt a sense of possibility unfurling within her chest. She was halfway to town when the sound of an approaching wagon made her heart sink. Stepping to the side of the road, she prepared to face whatever traveler was passing by, praying it wouldn't be someone who would report her movements to Edward. The wagon rounded the bend, and relief flooded through her when she recognized not Edward, but Elijah Blackwood at the reins. He pulled the horses to a stop beside her. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, tipping his hat. His eyes took in her traveling clothes and the carpet bag in her hand. A small smile crossed his features. "I see you've made your decision." "Yes," Abigail confirmed, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm leaving on today's stage." Elijah extended his hand. "Then allow me to offer you a ride the rest of the way. It wouldn't do to miss your departure." Gratefully, Abigail accepted his help into the wagon. As they continued toward town, she found herself studying his profile, the straight nose, strong jawline, and kind eyes that had offered hope when she'd had none. "I must thank you, Deputy," she said softly. "Without your intervention that night and your words afterward, I might never have found the courage to leave." Elijah kept his eyes on the road. "You had the courage all along, Mrs. Monroe. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us it's there." "Please," she said, "call me Abigail." His smile widened slightly. "Abigail, then, and I'm Elijah to my friends. Are we friends, Deputy Blackwood?" There was a hint of teasing in her voice that surprised her, a glimpse of the girl she had been before marriage had dimmed her spirit. "I'd like to think so," he replied, his tone matching hers. "Though I hope you'll forgive me for saying I'm glad you won't be staying in Whispering Creek long enough for us to find out." The statement brought reality crashing back. "Do you truly think I should go as far as Cheyenne?" "What if Edward follows me?" Elijah's expression turned serious. "Monroe strikes me as a man whose pride will be wounded more than his heart. He may rage for a time, but I doubt he'll pursue you far. Men like him prefer easier targets." The blunt assessment stung, even though Abigail knew it to be true. Edward had never loved her, not really. He had wanted a housekeeper, a cook, and occasionally a wife in his bedrolls that could be filled by any woman willing to tolerate his temper. "What will you tell him when he discovers I've gone?" she asked. "The truth that you left on the stage and that he would be wise to let you go." Elijah's hands tightened on the reins. "I won't lie to him, Abigail, but I won't help him find you either." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves providing a soothing backdrop to Abigail's tumultuous thoughts. When the buildings of Whispering Creek came into view, a mixture of excitement and terror swept through her. What if I can't do this? She whispered, more to herself than to Elijah. What if I'm not strong enough to start over? Elijah brought the wagon to a stop on the outskirts of town, turning to face her fully. Abigail, listen to me. The fact that you've survived these years with Edward, that you're sitting here now with the courage to leave, that already proves your strength. The rest is just details. His confidence in her was humbling. Thank you, she said simply, unable to articulate the depth of her gratitude. They continued into town, the streets busier than usual due to it being market day. Elijah guided the wagon toward the stage depot, a modest building adjacent to the town's only hotel. As they approached, Abigail could see the stagecoach already prepared for departure, the driver loading luggage while passengers milled about. Wait here, Elijah instructed, helping her down from the wagon. I'll purchase your ticket. Before she could protest, he strode toward the ticket counter, leaving Abigail standing nervously beside the wagon. Her eyes scanned the crowd, half expecting to see Edward's angry face among the townspeople. Instead, she met the curious gaze of Martha Wilkins, who was shopping at a nearby stall. Martha approached, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. Abigail, what are you doing here with the deputy? Edward said you were ill today. Abigail's mind raced for an explanation. I'm feeling much better now. Deputy Blackwood was kind enough to give me a ride into town for some medicine. Martha's eyes drifted to the carpetbag at Abigail's feet, then to the stagecoach. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You're leaving him, aren't you? There was no point in denying it. Yes, Abigail admitted. Please don't tell him you saw me, Martha, not until the stage is gone. To her surprise, Martha reached out and squeezed her hand. I won't say a word. Thomas would take Edward's side and She hesitated, then lowered her voice. I've seen the bruises, Abigail. I've wanted to help, but I didn't know how. Relief and gratitude flooded through Abigail. Thank you, Martha. Be safe, Martha whispered, glancing over her shoulder. And be happy. You deserve that much. With a final squeeze of Abigail's hand, Martha disappeared back into the market crowd, leaving Abigail touched by the unexpected support. Elijah returned moments later, ticket in hand. One passage to Cheyenne, he announced, handing it to her. The stage leaves in 20 minutes. Abigail stared at the ticket, reality settling over her like a heavy blanket. This is really happening. Second thoughts? Elijah asked gently. No, she said firmly. No second thoughts, just adjusting to the idea of freedom. They moved toward the stagecoach, Elijah carrying her bag. As the driver secured it with the other luggage, Abigail found herself reluctant to part from the one person who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. I don't know how to thank you, she began, turning to face Elijah. Live well, he replied simply. That will be thanks enough. A shout from down the street interrupted their farewell. Abigail's blood ran cold as she recognized Edward's voice, filled with rage as he pushed through the market crowd toward them. Abigail, he bellowed. What the hell do you think you're doing? Panic seized her. How did he know? Elijah's hand moved to his sidearm. It doesn't matter. Get on the stage, Abigail, now. Edward reached them before she could move, his face contorted with fury. So this is your plan, running off with this badge-wearing bastard behind my back. Edward, please, Abigail pleaded, aware of the growing crowd of onlookers. I left you a note explaining everything. A note? Edward laughed bitterly. You think 3 years of marriage can be ended with a damn note? His gaze shifted to Elijah, hatred blazing in his eyes. And you, deputy. I warned you to stay away from my wife. Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself between Abigail and Edward. Mrs. Monroe has made her decision, sir. I suggest you respect it and walk away. Or what? Edward challenged, his hand drifting toward the knife he kept at his belt. You'll shoot me for claiming what's rightfully mine. She's not property, Monroe. Elijah stated calmly, though Abigail could see the tension in his stance. She's a person making her own choice. Edward's laughter was ugly. Shows what you know about marriage, deputy. A wife belongs to her husband by law and by God. Not anymore, Abigail said, finding her voice at last. The words came stronger than she expected, carrying across the hushed crowd. I'm leaving, Edward. I won't live in fear any longer. Edward's face darkened. You're not going anywhere. He lunged forward, grabbing for her arm. Elijah moved with surprising speed, blocking Edward's advance and shoving him backward. That's enough, Monroe. Touch her again and you'll spend the night in a cell. For a tense moment, it seemed Edward might attack regardless of the consequences. His hands clenched into fists and his eyes darted between Elijah's resolute face and the gun at his hip. Stage to Cheyenne, all aboard, the driver called out, oblivious to the drama unfolding beside his coach. Go, Abigail, Elijah urged, not taking his eyes off Edward. Now. With a final, lingering look at both men, Abigail turned and hurried toward the stagecoach. The driver helped her aboard, and she settled into a seat beside an elderly woman who regarded her with sympathetic eyes. Through the window, she could see Elijah and Edward still locked in their standoff, neither man willing to back down. As the driver climbed up to his seat and took the reins, Edward made one last desperate move toward the coach. Elijah intercepted him, physically restraining him as the stagecoach lurched into motion. The last image Abigail had of Whispering Creek was Edward's face, contorted with rage, and Elijah's steady gaze finding hers through the window, a silent promise that she had made the right choice. As the town receded behind them, Abigail felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not tears of sadness or regret, but of relief, of release. For the first time in years, she was free. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days, with overnight stops at way station-inns along the route. Abigail spoke little to her fellow passengers, lost in her own thoughts and plans for the future. With each mile that separated her from Edward, she felt both lighter and more uncertain. Freedom, she was discovering, carried its own kind of weight, the weight of responsibility for one's own destiny. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Cheyenne on Thursday afternoon, Abigail was exhausted but determined. The city was larger than she had imagined, bustling with activity as the territorial capital and hub of the Union Pacific Railroad. Streets lined with businesses, hotels, and residences stretched out before her, overwhelming in their possibilities. With her meager savings, Abigail secured a room at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson. The woman asked few questions beyond whether Abigail could pay the weekly rate, which suited her perfectly. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking a quiet side street. That evening, as Abigail sat on her bed contemplating her next steps, the enormity of what she had done finally struck her. She was alone in a strange city, with limited funds and no clear plan beyond escaping Edward. The confidence Elijah had inspired in her began to waver in the face of reality. "One day at a time," she whispered to herself, remembering her mother's favorite advice for difficult situations. Just one day at a time. The next morning, Abigail rose early and set out to explore her new surroundings. Cheyenne in 1878 was a city in transformation, having evolved from a rough railroad town to the sophisticated capital of Wyoming territory in just a decade. While still bearing the marks of its frontier origins, it now boasted substantial buildings, churches, schools, and a thriving business district. Remembering Elijah's suggestion about teaching, Abigail made her way to the largest school building she could find. The principal, a stern-looking man named Mr. Hargrove, listened to her inquiry with polite skepticism. "Do you have any formal training, Mrs.?" he asked, peering at her over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Abigail Howard," she corrected, having decided to revert to her maiden name. "No formal training, sir, but I've always had a passion for education. I'm well-read and I learn quickly." Mr. Hargrove frowned. I'm afraid passion isn't a substitute for qualifications, Miss Howard. Our teachers are required to have at least a high school certificate, if not college education. Disappointment washed over Abigail, but she refused to be deterred. Perhaps there are other positions, an assistant or someone to help with the younger children. After some consideration, Mr. Hargrove reluctantly agreed to keep her in mind if such a position opened, but offered no immediate prospects. Disheartened but not defeated, Abigail continued her search throughout the day, inquiring at shops, restaurants, and hotels about employment opportunities. By evening, she had secured a position as a seamstress's assistant at a dress shop owned by a French immigrant named Madame Beaumont. The pay was minimal, but it would supplement her dwindling savings until something better came along. You have good hands, Madame Beaumont had observed, watching Abigail demonstrate her needlework. Steady and precise. Come tomorrow morning and we will see what you can do. It wasn't teaching, but it was honest work, and for now that was enough. Days turned into weeks as Abigail settled into her new life in Cheyenne. The work at Madame Beaumont's shop was demanding but satisfying. Abigail discovered she had a talent for design as well as stitching, and the Frenchwoman gradually allowed her to take on more responsibility, including working directly with customers. Her room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house became a sanctuary, decorated with small treasures found at the market, a vase of fresh wildflowers, a colorful quilt purchased from a traveling peddler, books borrowed from the small lending library down the street. For the first time, she was creating a space that reflected her own tastes, not accommodating someone else's. Yet despite these small victories, loneliness often crept in during quiet evenings. She had made acquaintances, the other women at the shop, her fellow boarders, the librarian who recommended books but no real friends. And though she would never admit it aloud, her thoughts frequently drifted to Deputy Elijah Blackwood, wondering what had happened after her departure. Had Edward caused trouble for him? Was he still in Whispering Creek, or had he moved on to another posting? She found herself scanning the faces of passing lawmen, half hoping, half fearing she might see his familiar features. It was in early September, nearly 2 months after her arrival in Cheyenne, that Abigail's carefully constructed new life was disrupted. She was working at the shop, pinning a customer's dress for alterations, when the bell above the door jingled. Glancing up, she froze, pins clutched in her fingers as Edward Monroe stepped into the shop. He looked different, thinner, his clothes disheveled, a several-day growth of beard darkening his face. But the cold anger in his eyes was exactly as she remembered. "Found you at last," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet shop. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" Madame Beaumont emerged from the back room, frowning at the interruption. "Monsieur, can I help you?" Edward ignored her, his gaze fixed on Abigail. "Get your things, we're going home." Abigail's customer, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, looked between them with alarm. "Miss Howard, do you know this man?" "He's my husband," Abigail admitted, her voice barely audible. "My former husband." Edward's laugh was harsh. "There's no former about it, Abigail. We're still very much married in the eyes of God and the law." Madame Beaumont, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Monsieur, I must ask you to leave. You are upsetting my customers and my employee." "Stay out of this, old woman," Edward snarled, advancing further into the shop. "This is between me and my wife." Fear paralyzed Abigail momentarily, but then something shifted within her. She had built this new life with her own hands. She would not surrender it without a fight. "Edward," she said, setting down her pins and straightening to her full height. "I left you a note explaining my decision. I'm not coming back." Fury contorted his features. "You think you have a choice? I've spent weeks tracking you down, Abigail. I've lost work, spent money we don't have. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," Abigail replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Please leave before someone calls the authorities." Edward's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. "You're coming with me now, or I'll drag you out of here by your hair." The bell above the door jingled again, and a deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I believe the lady asked you to leave." Abigail's heart leaped as she turned to see Elijah Blackwood standing in the doorway, hand resting on his holstered gun. He was out of uniform, dressed in a simple shirt, vest, and trousers, but his presence commanded the room just the same. Edward's grip on her wrist tightened painfully. "You again. Are you following me now, deputy?" "Not a deputy anymore," Elijah replied calmly. "And no, I'm not following you. I've been in Cheyenne for 3 weeks now. Pure coincidence that we crossed paths." "Coincidence," Edward spat. "You expect me to believe that? You've been chasing after my wife since the moment you laid eyes on her." Elijah's expression remained neutral. "Release her arm, Monroe. Now." For a tense moment, it seemed Edward might refuse. Then, with a final painful squeeze, he let go of Abigail's wrist. She rubbed the reddened skin, fighting back tears of pain and relief. "This isn't over," Edward warned, looking between them. "She's still my wife." "Perhaps legally," Elijah conceded. "But in every way that matters, she stopped being your wife the moment you locked her out in that storm." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Now, I won't ask again. Leave." Something in Elijah's tone, a quiet certainty that promised consequences, seemed to penetrate Edward's anger. With a final venomous glare at Abigail, he pushed past Elijah and stormed out of the shop. The silence that followed was broken only by Madame Beaumont's rapid French muttering as she locked the door behind him. Abigail's customer, white-faced with shock, allowed Madame to escort her to the back room for a calming cup of tea, leaving Abigail alone with Elijah. "Are you all right?" he asked, approaching her with concern etched on his features. Abigail nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her. How did you know where to find me?" A small smile touched his lips. "I didn't. Like I told Monroe, it was coincidence. I came to order a new shirt Madame Beaumont comes highly recommended." "But you said you've been in Cheyenne for 3 weeks," Abigail pointed out. "Why didn't you seek me out?" Elijah's expression turned serious. "I wanted to give you space to build your new life. I didn't want you to feel obligated because of my help." The consideration behind his words touched her deeply. "What happened after I left?" she asked. "With Edward, he made some threats, caused a scene," Elijah shrugged. "Sheriff Taylor calmed him down eventually. But a few weeks later, I decided it was time for a change. Cheyenne needed experienced lawmen, so here I am." Abigail studied his face, wondering how much of that decision had been influenced by thoughts of her. "And you're no longer a deputy, Marshal now," he corrected. "United States Marshal, assigned to the Wyoming Territory Court." Pride swelled in Abigail's chest, though she had no right to feel it. "That's wonderful. A well-deserved promotion." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities. Finally, Elijah cleared his throat. "He'll be back, you know. Men like Monroe don't give up easily when their pride is wounded." "I know," Abigail sighed, "but I won't live in fear of him. I can't go back to that life." "You won't have to," Elijah assured her. "There are laws against the kind of treatment you endured, Abigail, and as a marshal, I have some influence in how those laws are enforced." The offer of protection warmed her, but a new worry surfaced. What if he tries to hurt you instead? Edward has always been dangerous when cornered. Elijah's smile held a hint of grimness. "I can take care of myself, and him, if necessary." Madame Beaumont returned from the back room, eyeing them with undisguised curiosity. "Your customer has decided to return tomorrow, Abigail. Perhaps you should take the rest of the day to recover from this incident?" Grateful for the understanding, Abigail nodded. "Thank you, madam. I'll make up the hours tomorrow." As she gathered her shawl and reticule, Elijah shifted awkwardly. "May I walk you home, in case Monroe is still lurking about?" The prospect of spending more time with him sent a flutter through Abigail's stomach that had nothing to do with fear. "I would appreciate that, Marshal Blackwood." "Elijah," he corrected gently. "We're well past formalities, I think." Outside, the September afternoon was pleasantly warm, the streets busy with the usual traffic of wagons, horses, and pedestrians. Abigail was acutely aware of Elijah beside her, his tall frame a reassuring presence as they walked toward Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. "How have you been, truly?" he asked after they had gone a block in companionable silence. "Is Cheyenne everything you hoped?" Abigail considered the question carefully. "It's been challenging, liberating and terrifying in equal measure, but I don't regret leaving." "And the dress shop, is that fulfilling work for you?" "It's honest work," she replied. "Madame Beaumont is a fair employer and I'm learning a great deal about business as well as sewing. But it's not teaching," Elijah finished for her, demonstrating that he remembered their conversations from months ago. Abigail smiled sadly. "No, it's not teaching. Mr. Hargrove at the school made it clear I lack the necessary qualifications." Elijah frowned. "Have you considered further education yourself? The Territorial College offers courses for women now. On a seamstress's wages." Abigail laughed without humor. "I can barely afford my room and board as it is." They reached the boarding house, pausing at the bottom of the steps. Elijah turned to face her, his expression earnest. "What if there was another way? The marshal's office employs clerks to handle correspondence and record-keeping. The pay is better than what you're likely making at the dress shop, and the hours would allow you to attend evening classes at the college." Abigail stared at him, hope and suspicion mingling in her chest. "Are you offering me a position out of charity, Marshal Blackwood?" "Not charity," he assured her. "Practicality. You're intelligent, detail-oriented, and from what I've seen, unflappable under pressure. Those are valuable qualities in our line of work." The offer was tempting, too tempting. And what would people say? A married woman working closely with a single man. The gossip alone would be no worse than what they're already saying about a woman who left her husband, Elijah pointed out gently. "Besides, it's a government office, not a private arrangement. Everything would be above board and professional." Abigail hesitated, torn between opportunity and propriety. "I need time to consider it." "Of course," Elijah nodded. "The position won't be filled until the end of the month. Take all the time you need." As they stood there, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the boarding house steps, Abigail felt a curious mixture of emotions: gratitude, confusion, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. Again." Elijah's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made him look younger, less burdened. "You're welcome. Again." As he turned to leave, Abigail called after him. "Elijah," he paused, looking back expectantly. "Would you? That is, would it be inappropriate if—" She stumbled over the words, then straightened her shoulders and tried again. "Mrs. Peterson serves dinner at 6. Would you care to join us? As my guest." The surprise and pleasure that crossed his face was answer enough. "I'd be honored, Abigail." That evening marked the beginning of a new chapter in Abigail's life. Dinner at the boarding house was a simple affair: roast chicken, vegetables from Mrs. Peterson's garden, and apple pie for dessert, but the conversation flowed easily, especially once the other boarders discovered Elijah's role as a U.S. Marshal. His stories of maintaining law and order in the territories captivated everyone at the table, though Abigail noticed he was careful to omit the more violent details out of respect for the ladies present. After dinner, several of the boarders retired to the parlor for cards, but Abigail and Elijah slipped outside to the small porch, where the evening breeze provided relief from the stuffy dining room. "Thank you for inviting me," Elijah said, settling into one of the wooden rocking chairs beside her. "It's been a while since I enjoyed a home-cooked meal and pleasant company." "It was my pleasure," Abigail replied honestly. "You're quite the storyteller, Marshal. You had Mrs. Hollister hanging on your every word," Elijah chuckled. "Mrs. Hollister strikes me as a woman who appreciates a man in uniform, regardless of what he has to say." Their laughter mingled in the twilight air, comfortable and unforced. As silence settled between them, Abigail found herself studying his profile against the darkening sky, wondering at the path that had brought them both to this moment. "What made you become a lawman?" she asked, genuinely curious. Elijah considered the question, rocking gently in his chair. "My father was a violent man," he said finally. "Like Edward in many ways. When my mother finally found the courage to leave him, a local sheriff helped us escape to another town, gave us protection when we needed it most." Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. "So you wanted to be that person for others?" "Something like that," he nodded. "Though I'll admit the reality of the job isn't always as noble as the idea of it. There's a lot of paperwork, tedious investigations, and politicians to please." "Yet you still believe in it," Abigail observed. "The law, Justice? I have to," Elijah replied simply. "Otherwise, what's the point of any of it?" Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, books they had read, places they hoped to visit, memories of happier times in their respective childhoods. As the evening wore on, Abigail found herself more at ease with Elijah than she had been with anyone in years, perhaps ever. When the clock inside struck 9, Elijah reluctantly rose to leave. "I should go. Early start tomorrow." Abigail stood as well, suddenly shy. "Will I see you again?" "Besides, for the job consideration, I mean." "I'd like that very much," he answered, his voice warm. "Perhaps Sunday. There's a new park near the Capitol building. They say the autumn colors are at their peak." "Sunday would be perfect," Abigail agreed, trying to contain her delight at the prospect. As Elijah descended the porch steps, he turned back. "Abigail, about the clerk position, don't feel obligated. I meant what I said about your qualifications, but your friendship is far more important to me than filling a vacancy at the office." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you for understanding." After he had gone, Abigail remained on the porch for a long while, her mind replaying their conversations, her heart lighter than it had been in months. For the first time since arriving in Cheyenne, she felt not just free, but hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The following day, Abigail returned to the dress shop, half expecting to find Edward waiting for her. Instead, she was greeted by Madame Beaumont's usual brisk instructions and a pile of orders that had accumulated in her absence. "Your martial friend," Madame said casually as they worked side by side on a wedding gown. "He is handsome, no," Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's not my friend exactly, more of a benefactor." "Benefactor?" Madame raised an eyebrow. "Is that what they call it these days?" "It's not like that," Abigail protested. "He helped me leave my husband, that's all." Madame Beaumont's expression softened. "I had a husband once in France. He drank, he gambled, he made my life miserable. When he died of consumption, I felt only relief." She patted Abigail's hand. "There is no shame in seeking happiness, ma chérie, especially after suffering." The older woman's understanding brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "But I'm still married. In the eyes of the law and God, bah," Madame waved dismissively, "the law can be changed. As for God, I think he cares more about what is in our hearts than about papers signed before a judge." Though not entirely convinced, Abigail appreciated the sentiment. She threw herself into her work for the remainder of the day, trying to focus on the present rather than worrying about Edward's next move or analyzing her confusing feelings for Elijah. Sunday arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp, clear, and sunny. Abigail dressed with particular care in a russet-colored dress that complemented her auburn hair, which she wore partially up, with soft curls framing her face. It was the most fashionable she had looked since leaving Edward, who had preferred her appearance to be modest to the point of severity. Elijah arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, looking handsome in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a well-tailored jacket. His smile when he saw her made Abigail's heart flutter in a way that both thrilled and alarmed her. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The park was indeed lovely, with maple and oak trees displaying brilliant red and gold foliage against the backdrop of the territorial Capitol building. They strolled along the winding paths, discussing everything from territorial politics to the latest serialized novel in Peterson's magazine, which they had both been following. "Have you given any more thought to the clerk position?" Elijah asked as they sat on a bench overlooking a small pond. Abigail nodded. "I have, and I'd like to accept if the offer still stands." "It does," he confirmed, his expression pleased. "You can start next Monday if that suits you. I'll speak with Madame Beaumont, explain that we've recruited you for government service." "Thank you," Abigail said sincerely. "Not just for the job, but for believing in me. It's been a long time since anyone did." Elijah's gaze was warm. "You make it easy to believe in you, Abigail Howard." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt both novel and right. Abigail gave notice at the dress shop, where Madame Beaumont bid her farewell with genuine affection and an open invitation to return if her government adventure proved unsatisfactory. Her new position at the marshal's office was challenging but fulfilling. She organized case files, drafted correspondence, and gradually took on more responsibility as her competence became apparent. The pay was indeed better than the dress shop, and the working environment, though occasionally colorful when particularly rough prisoners were brought in, was respectful and professional. True to his word, Elijah maintained a proper distance during working hours, treating her with the same courtesy he showed all the office staff. But their evenings and Sundays became something to anticipate eagerly. They attended lectures at the Territorial College, where Abigail had enrolled in evening classes in literature and history. They explored Cheyenne's growing cultural offerings, concerts, exhibitions, even a traveling Shakespeare company that performed Much Ado About Nothing to enthusiastic crowds. Through it all, something deeper than friendship blossomed between them, though neither acknowledged it openly. The ghost of Abigail's marriage hung between them, an invisible barrier to the feelings that were increasingly difficult to ignore. As autumn gave way to winter, Abigail heard nothing more from Edward. She allowed herself to hope that perhaps he had finally accepted her departure and moved on with his life. This hope was shattered in early December when a letter arrived at the boarding house, addressed in Edward's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, Abigail broke the seal and read, "Abigail, I write not to beg your return, but to inform you that I have filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. The Territorial Court requires your signature on the enclosed papers. Once completed, you will be free of our union, as you so desperately wish. Do not mistake this for forgiveness. You have humiliated me before my neighbors and friends, but I find I have no desire to be bound to a woman who holds me in such contempt. Sign the papers and return them to the address listed. Let us be done with each other." Edward Monroe enclosed were legal documents confirming Edward's petition for divorce. Abigail stared at them in disbelief, emotions warring within her: relief, suspicion, and a strange sort of grief for the marriage that had once held such promise, only to wither into something ugly and destructive. She took the papers to work the next day, seeking Elijah's advice. He examined them carefully in the privacy of his office, his expression guarded. "They appear legitimate," he confirmed. "But I'd advise having our office attorney review them before you sign anything. Monroe isn't known for his honesty." Abigail nodded, still processing the unexpected development. "Why now? After all this time pursuing me, why would he suddenly grant me exactly what I wanted?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, considering. "People change. Perhaps he's met someone else, or perhaps he's simply tired of the chase." "You don't believe that any more than I do," Abigail said, studying his face. "There's something more to this." After a moment of hesitation, Elijah sighed. "There have been rumors. Monroe's been seen in some unsavory establishments in Laramie, gambling heavily. Word is he's in debt to some dangerous people. And a divorce would protect his assets," Abigail realized. "If creditors come after him, they can't touch property that's no longer legally connected to him." "It's possible," Elijah agreed. "But regardless of his motives, this could be your opportunity for a clean break. Legal freedom." The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Without the bonds of marriage, Abigail would be free to pursue not just a career or education, but a new relationship if she chose. "I'll have Mr. Patterson review the documents," Elijah said, referring to the office attorney. "In the meantime, try not to worry. One way or another, we'll ensure your interests are protected." The following week passed in a blur of anticipation. Mr. Patterson confirmed that the divorce petition was legitimate, though he negotiated some amendments to ensure Abigail retained rights to her personal property and would receive a small settlement from the sale of the farm, should Edward choose to sell. With the attorney's approval, Abigail signed the papers, her hand steady as she wrote her name. A weight she hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from her shoulders as she watched Mr. Patterson seal the documents for return to the court. "It will take some time for the court to process everything," he explained, "but barring any complications, you should be legally divorced by spring. The season of new beginnings." The symbolism wasn't lost on Abigail. As Christmas approached, Cheyenne transformed into a festive wonderland. Evergreen boughs and red ribbons adorned shop fronts, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. For Abigail, who had spent the previous Christmas trying to avoid Edward's drunken rage, the holiday season took on a magical quality she hadn't experienced since childhood. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house was no exception to the festivities. The parlor boasted a modestly decorated tree, and the dining table featured candles and holly centerpieces each evening. The boarders exchanged small gifts and shared stories of Christmases past, creating a sense of family among the disparate group. On Christmas Eve, after a splendid dinner of roast goose and all the trimmings, Elijah asked Abigail to join him for a walk despite the cold. Bundled in her warmest cloak and a new woolen scarf, his early Christmas gift to her, she agreed readily. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, transforming Cheyenne into a glistening wonderland under the moonlight. Their boots crunched on the freshly fallen snow as they made their way toward the city center, where the large community Christmas tree stood illuminated by hundreds of candles. "It's beautiful," Abigail breathed, her words forming small clouds in the frosty air. "Yes, it is," Elijah agreed, though when she glanced at him, he was looking at her, not the tree. They continued their walk, eventually finding themselves in front of the territorial courthouse, an imposing stone building that housed both the legal offices and the chamber where the divorce proceedings would eventually be finalized. "Strange to think that a piece of paper from this building will change the course of my life," Abigail mused, staring up at the darkened windows. "For the better, I hope," Elijah said quietly. "Definitely for the better," she affirmed. "Though I can't help but think about how different everything is from last Christmas. Then I was trapped and hopeless. Now, Elijah prompted when she trailed off. Abigail turned to face him, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "Now I have possibilities, a future of my own choosing." Elijah's expression was tender as he reached out to brush a snowflake from her cheek. "You deserve every happiness, Abigail. I hope you know that." The warmth of his touch lingered on her skin, and she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something stronger than propriety or caution. "And what about you, Elijah? What do you deserve?" His eyes, reflecting the distant glow of the Christmas lights, held her steadily. "I've been fortunate in many ways. My career, my health, good friends, but lately I've found myself wanting something more. What might that be?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Elijah slowly leaned down, giving her every opportunity to step away. When she remained still, her face upturned to his, he closed the distance between them, pressing his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tender, questioning, and over almost before it began. Elijah pulled back, studying her face for any sign of distress or regret. "I apologize if I've overstepped," he began, but Abigail silenced him by rising on her tiptoes and returning the kiss with more certainty. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Abigail asked, though she knew the answer. "Because you needed time. Freedom to discover who you are without a man's influence, even mine." His honesty was humbling. "And because, technically, you're still married." Reality intruded on their perfect moment, and Abigail sighed. "Yes, for a few more months at least." Elijah took her gloved hands in his. "I can wait, Abigail. I've waited this long. A few more months is nothing if it means doing things properly." His patience and respect touched her deeply. "And what happens after those few months?" A smile spread across his face, lighting his eyes with warmth that defied the winter chill. "After that, Miss Howard, I intend to court you openly and honorably if you'll permit it." Joy bubbled up within Abigail, spilling over into laughter that echoed in the quiet, snow-covered street. "I believe I would permit it, Marshal Blackwood, most enthusiastically." Their walk back to the boarding house was marked by a new awareness between them, hands occasionally brushing, glances exchanged that held promises for the future. At the bottom of the steps, Elijah kissed her once more, briefly but with feeling, before bidding her good night. Abigail floated up to her room, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Outside her window, snow continued to fall, covering Cheyenne in a pristine blanket that seemed to symbolize the fresh start awaiting her come spring. Winter in Wyoming was harsh but beautiful, much like the journey Abigail found herself on. January and February brought blizzards that occasionally kept her housebound, but also cozy evenings by the fire in Mrs. Peterson's parlor, often with Elijah as a welcome visitor. Their relationship remained circumspect in public, no more than friendly outings and conversations that might be expected between colleagues. But in those quiet moments, away from prying eyes, they allowed themselves the comfort of held hands, shared confidences, and occasional sweet kisses that left them both longing for the day when such affection need not be hidden. March arrived with its characteristic mix of lingering winter storms and tantalizing hints of spring. The divorce proceedings continued their slow progress through the territorial court system, delayed by Edward's absence from several scheduled hearings. Each postponement tested Abigail's patience, but Elijah's steady presence kept her grounded. "He's doing this deliberately," she confided one evening as they sat in the parlor, a respectable distance apart while Mrs. Peterson dozed in her rocking chair. "Edward knows how important this is to me, so he's dragging it out as punishment." Elijah's expression was thoughtful. "Perhaps, or perhaps there's more to it than spite. Mr. Patterson heard rumors that Monroe has left the territory entirely, creditors closing in possibly." The news was surprising. "Left, without finalizing the divorce, the court can proceed without him if he's truly abandoned the petition," Elijah explained. "It just takes longer." April brought not only showers of rain and the first wildflowers, but also news that would change everything. Mr. Patterson arrived at the marshal's office one Tuesday morning, legal documents in hand and a grave expression on his face. "Miss Howard," he said, using the name she had adopted professionally despite her still married status, "I'm afraid there's been a development in your case." Abigail's heart sank. "Another delay?" "No," Patterson shook his head. "Something far more significant. Your husband, Edward Monroe, was found dead 3 days ago in a Denver hotel room." The words hit Abigail like a physical blow. "Dead? How? The circumstances are unclear," Patterson said delicately. "Denver authorities suspect foul play possibly related to gambling debts. An investigation is underway." Elijah, who had joined them upon seeing Patterson enter, placed a steadying hand on Abigail's shoulder. "What does this mean for her legal status?" Patterson adjusted his spectacles. "Miss Howard is now a widow, not a divorcee. The marriage has been terminated by death rather than legal dissolution." A widow. The word echoed in Abigail's mind as she struggled to process this unexpected turn of events. She had wanted freedom from Edward, yes, but never this. Despite everything he had done, she had not wished him dead. "There will be legal matters to address," Patterson continued. "As his widow, you are entitled to his estate, such as it is. There may be debts to settle, property to dispose of." "I don't want anything of his," Abigail said automatically. "Nevertheless, the law is clear," Patterson insisted. "Unless he left a will stating otherwise, you inherit everything. I've taken the liberty of writing to the authorities in Whispering Creek to begin the process of assessing the estate." After Patterson departed, Elijah guided Abigail to his private office, concerned by her pallor and distant expression. "Sit down," he urged gently. "This is a shock, I know." "I should feel something," Abigail said numbly. "Grief, perhaps, or at least pity, but I feel nothing, just emptiness." "What kind of person does that make me?" "A human one," Elijah answered, kneeling beside her chair to meet her eyes. "Edward caused you immense pain. It's natural that his death brings complicated emotions." Tears filled Abigail's eyes, not for Edward, but for the young, hopeful bride she had once been, and for all the years of suffering that had followed. "I never wanted this. I only wanted to be free of him, to build a new life." "And you have," Elijah reminded her, taking her hands in his. "You've created a life to be proud of, Abigail. This doesn't change that." She nodded, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "What happens now, with us, I mean?" A small, sad smile crossed Elijah's face. "Now, propriety dictates that you observe a period of mourning, regardless of the circumstances of your marriage. And I respect that, Abigail. I'll wait, however long it takes." Though traditional mourning for a widow could last up to 2 years, Abigail knew that in frontier communities like Cheyenne, such strictures were often relaxed out of necessity. Still, appearances mattered, especially given her position at the marshal's office and her growing reputation in the community. 6 months, she decided. "I'll observe a 6-month period of mourning, not for Edward's sake but for my own conscience and to avoid scandalous gossip." Elijah nodded, understanding in his eyes. 6 months it is, then, and afterward?" "Afterward," Abigail finished for him, a hint of her earlier spark returning, "you may court me properly, Marshal Blackwood, with all the town watching and gossiping to their heart's content." The following months brought significant changes to Abigail's life. As Edward's widow, she inherited not only the farm near Whispering Creek, but also his outstanding debts, which, fortunately, the sale of the property was sufficient to cover. After settling all accounts, she found herself with a modest sum that, while not a fortune, provided a security she had never known. At Elijah's suggestion, she invested most of it, keeping only enough to move from Mrs. Peterson's boarding house to a small but charming apartment above the millinery shop on Central Avenue. The space gave her independence and privacy, as well as a place to store the few personal items she had claimed from the farm, her mother's china, some books, and family photographs that held sentimental value. Throughout her official mourning period, Abigail dressed in the subdued colors expected of a widow, though she dispensed with the more extreme elements of mourning attire. She maintained her position at the marshal's office, where her efficiency and intelligence had made her indispensable. Her evening studies at the Territorial College continued as well, with professors increasingly encouraging her to consider a full teaching certificate. Elijah, true to his word, maintained a respectful distance in public, limiting their interactions to professional matters and occasional group outings where their friendship would not raise eyebrows. In private, however, they exchanged letters, thoughtful, intimate communications that deepened their connection despite the physical separation society demanded. By October, as her mourning period neared its end, Abigail found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From a frightened woman locked out in the rain to an independent widow with a career, education, and prospects, the transformation seemed almost impossible to comprehend. On the evening marking exactly 6 months since the news of Edward's death reached her, Abigail sat in her apartment, reading one of Elijah's letters by lamplight. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Opening it, she found Elijah standing there, looking handsome in his best suit, a bouquet of autumn wildflowers in his hand. "Marshal Blackwood," she greeted him formally, though her smile betrayed her pleasure at seeing him. "This is unexpected." "Miss Howard," he replied, matching her tone while his eyes conveyed much more. "I believe today marks an important milestone." Abigail accepted the flowers, stepping back to allow him entry. "Does it? I hadn't realized you were keeping such careful track." 6 months, Elijah confirmed, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "To the day." "So formal," Abigail teased, arranging the flowers in a vase. "One might think you had something specific in mind calling at this hour." Elijah's expression turned serious. "I do, actually." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I had planned a more elaborate setting for this dinner at the hotel, perhaps, or a ride to that meadow you love outside town, but I find I can't wait another day." Abigail's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond, flanked by tiny sapphires that matched her eyes. "Elijah," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Abigail Howard, this past year has shown me what true courage looks like. You rebuilt your life from nothing, faced your fears, and emerged stronger than ever. I admire you more than I can express." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as he continued. "I promised myself I would wait until you were truly free, until you had time to discover who you are without a husband's influence. I believe that time has come." He took her hand gently in his. "I love you, Abigail, with all my heart. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with the history they shared and the future they might build together. Abigail thought of that rainy night more than a year ago, when a stranger's kindness had offered her the first glimpse of what life could be without fear. She thought of all the ways Elijah had supported her independence even while making his own feelings clear. And she thought of how different this proposal was from Edward's hasty, presumptuous asking of her father for her hand, without ever consulting her own wishes. "Yes," she said finally, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Elijah, I will marry you, not because I need a husband, but because I want you specifically as my partner in life." Joy transformed his features as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the lamplight with every small movement of her hand. "When?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. "I know the traditional engagement period is at least a year, but I think we've observed enough traditions," Abigail interrupted with a smile. "Spring, perhaps." "When the wildflowers return, spring it is," Elijah agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that spoke of patience rewarded and a future bright with possibility. News of their engagement spread quickly through Cheyenne's close-knit community. While a few raised eyebrows at the timing barely 6 months after Edward's death, most who knew Abigail's story responded with genuine happiness for the couple. Madame Beaumont insisted on creating Abigail's wedding dress as her gift, while Mrs. Peterson volunteered her spacious garden for the ceremony, which would be small but meaningful. Winter passed in a flurry of preparations and deepening affection. Elijah purchased a modest house on the outskirts of town close enough for convenient access to their work, but with enough land for a garden and perhaps, someday, room for children to play. Abigail filled it with carefully chosen furnishings that reflected both their tastes, creating a home that felt nothing like the cold, controlling environment Edward had maintained. As April turned to May, the Wyoming landscape erupted in a riot of wildflowers, painting the plains in purples, yellows, and blues. It was against this backdrop of renewal that Abigail and Elijah were married on a perfect spring morning, surrounded by friends who had become family. Abigail wore Madame Beaumont's creation, a gown of ivory silk with delicate lace accents, elegant but far less restrictive than traditional wedding attire. At 23, she was a different bride than she had been at 18, confident, independent, and choosing marriage from a place of strength rather than necessity. Elijah, watching her approach through Mrs. Peterson's flower-lined garden path, thought she had never looked more beautiful. His vows, spoken in a voice husky with emotion, promised not only love and fidelity but also respect for her dreams and ambitions, a partnership of equals, rather than the unbalanced relationship she had known before. "I take you, Abigail Howard, not as a possession but as my chosen companion," he said, holding her hands in his as the minister and their assembled friends looked on. "I promise to support your independence even as we build a life together, to listen when you speak, and to stand beside you through whatever challenges we may face." Abigail's answering vows were equally heartfelt. "I take you, Elijah Blackwood, as my husband and partner, freely and joyfully. I promise to build our home on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding, to cherish your kindness without taking advantage of it, and to face our future together with the courage you helped me discover in myself." As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Elijah leaned down to seal their union with a tender kiss, Abigail felt the final pieces of her past falling away. This was not an ending but a beginning, one she had chosen with clear eyes and an open heart. The celebration that followed was lively and joyful, with music provided by local musicians and food prepared by Mrs. Peterson and the other boarding house residents. As evening approached, the newlyweds slipped away to their new home, eager to begin their life together in private. Standing on the porch of the house that was now truly theirs, Elijah lifted Abigail into his arms to carry her across the threshold, not as a symbol of possession, but as a playful homage to tradition that made them both laugh with pure happiness. Inside, with the door closed against the world, Elijah set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Home," Abigail repeated, savoring the word and all it now represented. "It has such a different meaning now." "How so?" Elijah asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. Abigail leaned into his touch, her eyes meeting his with unwavering certainty. "Before, home was a place I was trapped. Now it's wherever we are together." As twilight deepened into night, they celebrated their union in the most intimate way, learning each other with gentle hands and whispered words of love. For Abigail, who had known only duty and fear in Edward's bed, the experience was a revelation, a joining of equals, each giving and receiving pleasure with care and attention. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Abigail's head resting on Elijah's chest, she listened to the steady beat of his heart and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. "What are you thinking?" Elijah asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I was thinking about that night in the rain," she admitted. "How terrified I was when I saw a rider approaching, and how that moment of fear changed everything." Elijah's arms tightened around her protectively. "I still get angry when I think of finding you like that, soaked and shivering on your own porch while he was warm inside." "Don't," Abigail soothed, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Without that night, we might never have met. And I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything, even if it meant erasing all the pain that came before." His expression softened. "You continue to amaze me, Abigail Blackwood. Your capacity for forgiveness, for finding light in darkness, it's extraordinary." "Not forgiveness," she corrected gently. "Understanding. Edward's cruelty shaped my past, but it doesn't control my future. That belongs to us now." As they drifted towards sleep in each other's arms, Abigail felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The frightened woman locked out in the rain was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and deeply loved. The cowboy who had brought her in from that storm had become not just her rescuer but her partner, loving her not despite her experiences, but because of the person those experiences had helped her become. Together, they had found something precious, a love built on respect, understanding, and unwavering support. In the years to come, there would be challenges and joys, sorrows and celebrations, but they would face them as they had begun side by side, equal in strength and united in purpose. And whenever storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Abigail would remember that sometimes what seems like the darkest moment is actually the beginning of the brightest future. For her, being locked out in the rain had ultimately led to being brought in for good, not as a possession, but as a beloved partner in a life richer and more fulfilling than she had ever dared to dream possible. 5 years later, Abigail stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Elijah lifted their 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth onto his shoulders. The little girl's delighted laughter carried across the garden where their 5-year-old son James was carefully tending to the vegetables they had planted together earlier that spring. "Higher, Papa, higher," Elizabeth demanded, her small hands clutching Elijah's hair as he pretended to be her horse. "Any higher and you'll touch the clouds, little one," Elijah replied, his face alight with the joy that fatherhood had brought him. Abigail rested her hand on her slightly rounded belly, where their third child had just begun to make its presence known. At 28, she had built a life that her younger self could scarcely have imagined: a loving marriage, beautiful children, and a career as a teacher at Cheyenne's growing women's college, where she specialized in literature and composition. Elijah had risen to the position of Chief Marshal for the Wyoming Territory, a role that carried significant responsibility but also allowed him more regular hours to spend with his family. Their home had become a gathering place for friends and colleagues, known for its warmth and hospitality. As she watched her family play in the late afternoon sunlight, Abigail felt the familiar wave of gratitude that often overtook her in quiet moments. The path that had brought her here had not been easy, but every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to create this life of purpose and love. Elijah looked up, catching her gaze across the garden. The connection between them, forged in that moment of crisis years ago, had only deepened with time and shared experiences. He still looked at her with the same tenderness and respect he had shown that rainy night, when he had offered her not just shelter but possibility. "Mama, look," James called, proudly holding up a carrot he had pulled from the garden. "I grew it all by myself." "It's perfect," Abigail praised, descending the porch steps to join her family. "The very best carrot I've ever seen." As the sun began to set over their little piece of Wyoming, casting long golden shadows across the land, Abigail Blackwood gathered her children close and leaned into her husband's embrace. Once locked out in the rain, she had found not just shelter but a home in every sense of the word, a place of safety, growth, and unwavering love. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had created together, both Abigail and Elijah knew with absolute certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged with each other forever.